you can do a lot of work around policy questions, and some good examples of those are things like if you can link business registers with people registers, you can start working on questions around the way entrepreneurs work, things like entrepreneurial qualifications and things like that. So that's one tangible example. And then another thing you can do by having integrated register systems, of course, is you work into the world of the spine, the business spine, which we hear quite a lot about. And the business spine will sort of enable us to link more administrative data and more data basically to registers to again optimize and make the most use of the register. So in this idea of the integrated register world, you actually put the register at the center of your economic statistical production, and it will enable you to make new statistics. And that takes us really into the realm perhaps of register-based statistics, which we don't hear so much about these days. And I remember when I was young going to a talk by, I think it was two Swedish colleagues, Wahlgren and Wahlgren, is that right? Did you know them? Who wrote a famous book on register-based statistics and did quite a lot of work on it. And I think the way the technology is moving these days enables us to do a great deal more with the register, in the register space. And I think we're now moving into that domain where we can do more like register-based statistics. And I find that's quite interesting. It's quite an interesting development, which is why I thought this was a good session. So, for example, in the UK, the work that we're doing potentially will enable us to do that sort of thing. So currently we're looking at getting employment data from our revenue department, linking that to the register. The employment data from the register department is great, but it's got very poor classification, for example. So if you link that to our register, you can now have got good classification, and you could effectively almost use that employment information then to produce an output as an employment measure on its own by just linking it to the register. So that is an idea of how you can, get an integrated, how you can use this integrated register system idea. So this morning's session we have 5 speakers, and we've got papers covering. We've got three papers really covering plans or the work that's been done on integrated systems already. And then we've got a paper on an example from Italy, an example on how you can produce outputs using this sort of integrated system. And then we've also have a paper from Eurostat on their plans for the interoperability framework and creating linking across countries, actually. Okay, so thank you. And so that's the introduction. So our first speaker is from Canada, Sujat, who's going to give us a talk about the integrated systems in Canada. The title of his paper is Statistical Canada's Statistical Registration Integration Project. There. So thank you very much.
Hello. Okay. Good morning to everyone here and everyone watching on YouTube around the world. That was a great introduction by Andrew. It actually covers a lot of the main topics that we'll be covering here as well. Perfect. All right, so a brief outline of the presentation I'll be giving today. I'm going to begin by going over the current context we have at Statistics Canada, and then briefly touching on the structure of our statistical registers integration that we're working on. I'll cover the benefits that we see in having this integrated register system, including the support it'll provide for our new data management and production strategy at Statistics Canada. I'm going to touch a little bit more in detail on the building register specifically and the work we've done over the past couple of years in bringing this to production, as well as how it will complement our business register once they're linked together. And finally, I'm going to talk about our register matching engine, which is really at the heart of what we're doing here with our linked registers. So briefly, the context currently at Statistics Canada. The way we're organized, we're within a division called Statistical Registers and Geography Division. We have a business register, we have an address register, and then we have a bunch of geographic coding and conceptual services. None of these registers talk to each other, and the geography is very much focused on census geography. On the business register, we have our own processes to derive geography based mostly on things like postal code. It's a fairly good way to do things, but it's a bit of a blunt instrument. And so we find that at a granular level, we're missing a lot of actual geographic detail. So going forward, what we've embarked upon is the development of a new infrastructure of core interconnected statistical registers. So as Andrew mentioned, the idea is to bring together a number of different registers and allow them to speak to one another and have a bunch of services surrounding them and processes. So we envision this as a coherent basis for the agency's statistical programs to facilitate the integration of various types and volumes of data, and also to create various types of outputs. As Andrew mentioned, register-based statistics are something we're very interested in moving towards, reducing response burden, as well as augmenting survey data where we will continue with surveys. So the new infrastructure will consist of 4 core registers: the population register, the building register, the business register, and long-term inactivity register, which I'll briefly talk about. And as I mentioned, we'll have various processes and tools surrounding these registers, as well as a data lake, data warehouses. And I'll talk about some of these tools as well. So here it is in picture form. I know sometimes a lot of arrows and colors like this can be intimidating to look at, but it's fairly simple in terms of the concept we're going towards. You can see a theme here, which is essentially bringing together under one roof all of the processes that now take place all over our agency. We want to centralize a lot of these processes and make them generic. So the top line of this diagram essentially is just showing all the different sources of data we see coming in the future. All of these things will be brought in through a front door going forward. So we're currently in a situation where we have different subject matter areas, different groups within Statistics Canada, bringing in different types of data, housing it on their own side. We do have an administrative data inventory, but it's kind of an unwieldy tool that's in Excel. So going forward, what we want to do is have a front door that acquires all of this data, and this has already begun within our administrative data division at Statistics Canada. We have a group that's responsible for acquiring new sources of data and administrative data. We'll have a front door quality evaluation and registration process, as well as a pre-processing step that will take place at the corporate level to make sure that all of these files adhere to certain formats that we'll require later on in the process. As you can see, everything then will come into the statistical registers division through the register matching engine. I'll talk about that in more detail later on. For now, I'll just mention that essentially the register matching engine has 2 roles. One is to match to the registers to find out when there's new records that need to be added to the registers, especially the population and the building register. The business register, we already have a well-established process to bring in administrative files from our tax services. And then the other thing it will do is bring in data files, de-identify those files, so strip off anything that could identify people or specific buildings or locations and businesses, and provide them with statistical numbers which can then easily be linked back to the core registers. So you see that process at the side. On the other side, you can see the supporting processes that take place. So things like profiling of businesses, coding and classification, quality assurance, geographic services, as well as any other types of processes that will take place. At the bottom, you see our main programs. So currently, we have a very generic and centralized process for business statistics. We have about 200 surveys using the business register as their frame. They feed information back to the register. They're all coherent in their concepts. Going forward, this infrastructure will also allow us to move towards the same kind of setup for our social surveys, the census, and various research and analysis programs. So research and analysis, I just want to mention now that we have a lot of partnerships with universities throughout Canada and data researchers. We have research data centers throughout the country. Researchers can become deemed employees of Statistics Canada so they can work with the microdata. This setup will also allow them, one, to do that without having to actually see confidential information anymore. Even at the microdata level, they don't necessarily need to see the names of people or buildings or businesses. So it might provide more flexibility in that regard, how we work with the researchers external to Statistics Canada. And it'll also allow them to bring their data sets in more easily, run them through our processes, and then link it back in whichever ways they would like. And Picasso, you can see on the side there, I'll mention that. It's a metadata and data management service that's been created by the agency. All right, so the core registers. The Statistical Business Register, I'm sure you're all very familiar with. It's a complete listing of businesses and institutions in Canada. I will mention that for the work we're doing for the integrated registers, and as an aside to that as well, we're creating a longitudinal business register. Work on that has been ongoing the past year and should be moving into completion next year. The longitudinal business register will allow us to more easily link records across time to the other registers. And as I believe later on today, my colleague Tammy and I think Norbert will be discussing, it provides a basis for entrepreneurship statistics as well. So that's a real priority right now. The statistical business building register, will be a complete listing of residential and non-residential buildings in Canada. It'll provide a few benefits, which I'll discuss later on. One of the main ones that I'll talk about right now is it provides the ability to place people and businesses in their geographic location. So as I mentioned, right now we're using kind of an unwieldy process and kind of a blunt process to do this geocoding. The building register essentially will enable us to geocode to what we call the block face for any building in Canada, ideally. So you'll be able to determine where every building is. And then we have a hierarchical geographic structure so that above the block face you have a block, above the block you have the city block, so on and so forth, all the way up to the country level. And the reason we do that is it's a hierarchy so that if you have the basic block or the block face, essentially you can build up to any other geography you want, which is important in Canada for health researchers because we have things like health regions and other geographic classifications. And so creating it in a hierarchy allows people to link back to whatever they want. The Statistical Population Register is a listing of all persons residing in Canada. It's being built to support eventually an evolution towards an administratively supported census, so essentially a mixed census where we go out and ask for some responses from people, but some of the census is built administratively. It'll also benefit the social survey programs at Statistics Canada. So currently, we really don't have a population register to speak of. We have a demographic database that is built from the census every 5 years, but it is not evergreen. So with the population register, social survey and household survey programs will be able to actually create samples of people and roster them before going out into the field, whereas currently we have a situation where really they're sampling at the address level and then building rosters when they're in the field. And long-term, we'll have a statistical activity register, which will record the interactions between individuals and institutions in society. So essentially, it's the end game of this, to be able to link the people to where they work, which schools they've gone to, where they live, et cetera, et cetera. Exploration work is underway on this, and that will be more formally incorporated in a few years into the project. The register matching engine, I have another section on this further on, but for now I'll just mention that it's essentially the tool to integrate data within the register system and the environment, de-identify that data, and allow for linkages to registers and other data files within the data lake or data marts. And Picasso is a tool developed by Statistics Canada for data and statistical metadata management. So it's a central corporate registry of fit-for-use data assets from all sources. So essentially the idea here is that people will be able to search the data warehouse from this tool centrally to understand whether there are data sources already for something they're interested in. So there won't be questions about whether there's a gap in certain data. They can just go to Picasso and find that. And Picasso also houses the metadata required to use that data. All right, so the benefits of the SRI. The infrastructure provides the spine, as Andrew mentioned as well, that word, for Statistics Canada's new data management and production strategy. So there's a real push to move away from survey instruments to move towards administrative data and register-based statistics. There's a number of factors for this. It's, of course, more efficient from a cost perspective. As well, it reduces the burden on the citizens. So that is the first pillar of our new strategy, which is a less survey-centric approach to statistics. So having the SRI, we'll be able to maintain this robust set of characteristics about the people, buildings, and businesses in Canada, and will allow us to ingest data quickly, process it very quickly, and then it can be used in tandem with the registers, which they're already linked to, either to create this register-based statistics or to augment statistics that are being created from survey programs. So people can link non-survey data to their populations a lot more easily than they do currently. It'll also facilitate that type of data integration. So the integrated registers and the RME together will allow for the processing and integration of this data in a very timely manner. It also allows for that efficient registration of all of this data. So since it's coming through a central portal, we'll be able to register it all in Picasso very easily so that people aren't wondering what we have and what we don't have in our vast data holdings. Common frames and common processes. So there's been a big push, even over the last decade at Statistics Canada, to move towards common processes and common frames. I believe in 2010, there was about 50 surveys using the business register in what we would call a fully integrated manner. So they were actually just taking their entire population from the register, using the concepts of the register. Over the last 8 years, we've added about 150 surveys to that number. So there's 200 surveys now. Pretty much the entire economic statistics program at Statistics Canada is using the business register. So we want to continue that trend. I already mentioned the idea about files and data being received via front door and processed and then sent to us to run through our RME. The other thing this will allow is for all survey programs to actually use the registers, the population register, the building register. Currently on the social side, people use the address register as a basis for creating their frames, but then they don't fully use that. They have additional supplementary sources that they link to the register, and it's not really controlled in any kind of centralized manner. The other thing I want to mention, it kind of came up yesterday, was this idea of having the business register linked to collection. So we also actually have a robust integration with our survey collection at Statistics Canada. So all surveys, they sample from the business register, and then the survey files feed directly into collection from our side. This allows for a couple of things. It allows for collection management to essentially be streamlined. So for survey areas, it's very transparent what's happening. They have a sample chosen by methodology. It feeds to the registers. We add the respondent information, and then we send it to collection directly. There's no mediation from any other parties taking place, which kind of, on our view, simplifies matters a little bit. So the hope is with the population and the building register, and we're working towards this with collection, is to have the same type of integration across all of the survey programs. And timeliness of data, we touched on this a little bit, but integrating data more quickly, ingesting it more quickly will allow for our partners as well as our employees to more quickly link data together, merge it for analysis, process it, and ultimately disseminate it. It'll also reduce manual and ad hoc processes that currently take place. So there's a lot of record linkage taking place across our agency right now, and the hope is to centralize that and save people a lot of time. Data management, security, and de-identification. So this is a big pillar of what we're doing. We want to ensure that the data we have is secure and that there's no risk of disclosure. When you start working with the population register, the privacy implications become a little bit higher than on the business side. So we're implementing a few things. We already have a need-to-know principle that we adhere to at Statistics Canada. This is being formalized more so in this new registers infrastructure, where users will be assigned certain personas based on what their actual job function is. And then those personas have access to different levels of data. So for example, a methodologist would have access to more information than a subject matter analyst would necessarily need. So those personas would be set ahead of time. The confidentiality of the data is also managed by that de-identification process. So whenever we receive a data file within the agency, the first thing we're going to do is strip off any identifying information. So if you have a file from Tammy Hoogstein, her driver's license, we're going to strip off her name and any other kind of identifying information, but we're going to use that information in the background to link together other data files. Access to the registers, as well as the data lake, data marts, and warehouses, is access controlled through our corporate access request system. This is a central system where essentially directors have the authority and the power to provide access to certain information. So it's their responsibility to ensure that the people requesting access actually require it. And our existing information management policies and directives will help determine retention periods. So we already have fairly stringent retention periods on the business register in terms of sampling files, frame files, collection files. We're going to implement some of those as well on the building side and the population side, to ensure that we don't have lots of data just lying around that we don't require. And response burden tracking. So the new registers will borrow many of the response burden tracking practices already employed by the business register. So on the business register side, we track every unit that is sampled, every unit that's actually sent to collection, as well as the outcome of collection, the collection method, and a number of other metrics. We're going to implement this on the new registers as well, so that every unit will be tracked and compiled, and these burden metrics will be accessible by methodologists and subject matter. They don't use this response burden when drawing a sample, of course. It introduces sampling bias. It is still a useful metric to have. And one thing that it provides is that it allows transparency for collection insofar as we suppress records that require survey relief or that are overburdened on the register side instead of sending them to collection to do that work. All right, so building the building register. As I mentioned, we do have an address register currently at Statistics Canada. It's a residential address register. It's the basis for the census. So when we conduct the census, about 80% of Canada's population receives a mail-out form based on the address register. So there's this 20% gap, mostly in rural areas, that the address register can account for. And it's currently built from mostly post office files we receive, as well as some telephone billing files, some tax information, and other online directories. Recently, we started to use satellite imagery and listing exercises to try to augment that rural gap. But there is no existing administrative registry of buildings in Canada. So to build the building register, we kind of had to start from first principles. So there's actually two processes in place. One was they took the address register and the business register and essentially just melded them together. The idea being you have all the residential and non-residential buildings. But in parallel to that, they are also building it from first principles, and that is the one they want to actually put into production. So they're using new data sources like emergency services listings. So the police have this precise locational data for everyone in Canada. And our administrative data partners have been able to get those files. Property valuation files are also very important, and cadastral data, because it actually tells you whether a building is residential or non-residential. It can tell you something about the property value, which is more and more important as we create housing statistics. We're receiving utility files, hydro, smart meter, natural gas. And there were some exercises in web scraping from online sources and also crowdsourcing of building data. That's really in the preliminary stages and not as helpful as the other three we've found. There are limitations. So the main functional roles we see for the building register once it goes into production. As I mentioned, there's a mechanism through which the activities of people, businesses, and institutions will be linked to a specific geographic location. So currently that geographic coding takes place in a number of ways. This will centralize that through one register. The geography derived from that one register will then be used on all the other registers and all other statistical outputs coming from Statistics Canada. It'll be important for many types of statistical projects requiring record linkage or household rostering. So there's many opportunities to link people to specific buildings and businesses back to locations. Rostering, as I mentioned, all of the social survey programs right now, they sample at the household level and then they have to roster the people living in those households out in the field. It creates a great cost. They also have to oversample quite a bit because of that. This will allow them to determine the household composition before they go into the field and to create better populations as a result. This will also be the basis for statistics and analysis pertaining to the buildings as statistical units in and of themselves. So housing data is becoming more and more important in Canada. There's a lot of foreign capital coming into Canada buying a property, and there's a lot of demand for statistics on this. How many of the properties are foreign owned? What is the value of those properties, et cetera, et cetera. The building register will help augment that. Just in and of itself, you'll be able to find a lot of details about buildings, their footprints. It will play a central role in the management of survey operations. So currently, enumerators and survey takers don't have access to, am I getting the yellow card? Yeah. Okay, they don't have access to any type of data in the field. And they go out on a listing exercise and they're essentially going out blank. This will allow them to get a very good sense of the buildings that are already in existence and what they should be seeing from a residential, non-residential perspective. And it'll form a benchmark that should reconcile to and provide a quality assurance mechanism for the other registers, which is a segue into the benefits for the business register. So an evergreen building register, built independently from a variety of sources, can confront and augment the coverage of the BR. And it can benefit the BR in a few ways. It can assist profiling activities by flagging enterprises that may need to be profiled for additional locations. It can allow the automation of the creation of certain locations. And I'll just mention with the last point there, the business register for a few years has been involved in essentially the allocation of survey data to the location level. In Canada, there's a bigger push to get this kind of granular data, city GDP, for example, location level data. So we create our own allocation factors that are used by the economic statistics programs. There are gaps in that we've been trying to fill by using employment data and other sources to create what are called allocation entities on the business register. We see the building register as another great opportunity to essentially build out our location data on the BR and allow for greater allocation. All right, and this is the last slide here, the register matching engine. So as I mentioned, it's a high-performance record linkage engine that will serve as kind of the heart of this statistical registers infrastructure. It allows for the integration of numerous data sources without having a unique and universal administrative identifier across sources. We'll be creating those identifiers on our side. So those numbers will be assigned by us. It allows for the de-identification of data. I want to mention that to clarify, it's used for two purposes. One is to maintain the registers by identifying records that need to be added to the registers. And it can also be used to link other data files to the existing register records. We're also going to provide a record linkage service composed of custom processes for individual clients. So oftentimes we'll have external government agencies coming to us. They won't necessarily be able to pull something from our register. They'll say we have this list of units that we know are getting venture capital and we need to survey them. This will allow us to link those records back to the business register in a much more seamless way. The matching process itself, I'll just quickly say, the RME is composed of a suite of tools to process data and perform matching. We're using a deterministic rules-based approach to this. It's not a probabilistic or machine learning approach. There was a number of reasons for that. One main reason was performance. But we also, since we're working with the micro data, wanted to be able to, in each instance, point back to the reason for a match. We didn't want to have this fuzzy area where we're not sure why records are matching together. We want the matching analysts to be able to pinpoint exactly why certain records are matching together. So in that sense, it allows for this heuristic matching, like in both senses of that word. It'll also allow for the tracing of decisions, like I mentioned, and it's more well-suited to the kind of hierarchical matching we need for geocoding. It allows the rules to essentially work through the different geo levels if we needed to. And it's highly parameterized. So the matching analysts can essentially change the matching algorithms based on the files they're working with. And that's what we see as a long-term vision. When we receive a new file, it will be parameterized by these experts, and then it'll go into production where it's more automated. And then it outputs a series of score functions and comparators. It uses weights for the different variables. And we'll also be releasing a full suite of quality indicators and measures. We also allow for multi-link and weak link resolution, depending on the client and what's required from them. So that is everything. Questions, please?
Thank you very much. That's brilliant, Sujat. Right, let's have some questions, please. Netherlands first.
Thank you for your presentation. I was wondering, the linking of records, on what type of level do you do that? Do you do that on statistical unit level, or on legal unit level, or even lower, or on all levels?
The linking, sorry?
The linkings between the records of the different parts of the registers. So the building register and the people to the companies. Do you link them on enterprise unit level or on legal unit level? Or?
No, so we'll actually be linking them at the statistical level where they link. So on the business register in Canada, we have the enterprise. We also have the company, establishment, and the location, which my understanding is not prevalent everywhere on business registers. So the linkage for the buildings will take place to the actual location level or the establishment level. It'll essentially roll up the statistical levels. But if you have a company with a number of locations underneath it, we will link their building to the location itself. From that, you'll be able to derive the enterprise, though, very easily as well.
Thank you. I think United Nations, Ron.
Yes. Thank you for a very good presentation. It's very information dense, so I don't know if I picked up everything here. I'm sure I didn't. But my question is on the how you manage. So there are quite a number of registers there, which probably be updated by different sources. Mm-hmm. How do you manage to in the updating process, which takes priority? If something changes in one register, maybe it has a consequence for one of the other registers as well. So in the interlinking, what is the managing process? If you can say something about that.
Yeah, so I'll mention that each of the registers will be built and managed separately. The business register, the main basis is the tax data. The building register, it looks like the 911 and the hydro files are going to be the basis for that. And then the population register, there's a number of different files. They use different, like within the population register, there's different entropy scores and things like that to determine which source is the most accurate. So it's a little bit more dynamic than the business register would be, in the sense that as different sources come in with different information, they will use those sources to update the population register. Another function of the RME that I didn't mention would be to actually link the different registers together in the sense that you're talking about, so that if there's a change in a building, for example, a building's demolished and it disappears from the building register, it'll send a signal to the population register that these 4 people living in that building no longer live in that building. Yeah, I hope so. And well, they're not living there either way, but essentially what would happen on a geographic level is they'd try to place those people in another building based on administrative sources. If they can't, the geography will just keep rolling up until they can place them somewhere. So whether it's at the city level, what we call the census division level, a province level, or if we can't do any of that, we'll just know these 4 people live in Canada still.
Thank you. Poland's next, I think.
Okay, thank you for nice presentation, very interesting one. I would like to ask you, you talked about address register you have. How frequently it is updated?
So we release the address register 4 times a year. It's quarterly. So the updates come in on an ongoing basis. The telephone files we receive monthly. The postal code file we receive monthly as well. But currently the way it was built, there's a number of manual processes involved, which is why it's only released quarterly, as opposed to our business register frame, which is 12 times a year, once a month. With the new building register, though, the idea is, again, to follow on the business register and do it 12 times a year.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Yeah, Netherlands again.
I was wondering, do you also know where, in which kind of establishment people work? So,
Yeah, so that is the goal of the activity register. That is much more long-term. We're hoping
Okay.
2024, 2025 is the number I've heard.
so
But long-term, that's what we'd like to do. Because we do have a number of survey programs that right now, they can use, like we have something called a T4 file, essentially, that is a tax file at the end of the year that employers have to give their employees. That's the best source we have now, but the problem is it can be up to 15 months in arrears. So it's not very timely. So working on this and finding data sources, because there are other sources, we're just not receiving them from our tax agency. So it's been flagged as a priority from our administrative data division to acquire these files so that we can make those links between people and their places of employment.
Eurostat.
Hi, thanks for a very interesting presentation and a lot of information given. On the statistical activity register, I mean, we just heard that could be used for this linking of the place of employment and the people. But could you elaborate a little bit more? I mean, what other things? Because you said that this would be integrating, information on interaction between the people and the institution.
Yeah, so the idea would be that you could follow someone essentially from birth, know which hospital they were born at, know which schools they attended, know which institutions they've interacted with. We put out a pretty robust set of justice statistics as well, but you can get a greater sense from this activity register of people's interactions with the justice system, recidivism, things like that. Track that in a much more kind of robust way. So the idea is essentially all of their social interactions with institutions would be captured.
Thank you. I think, Norbert Rayner was next. I don't know what organisation you're from, Norbert? Independent consultant.
Hi, thank you. My question refers to the buildings register, because I think in the system of these linkages between the registers, the building register has a very central role. And my question would be, are there any administrative organizations involved in the updating and maintaining of the building register? So for instance, in our case, we involve the municipalities, which are the ones that are responsible by law for all the construction work, and they have to make license to construction work, as well as with the addresses and the street numbers and all these things. And these municipalities can directly integrate their information to our building register. And they can also, and they should also, integrate the information about the building, so the size, the number of stores, and all these characteristics which for a building census, at least in Europe, is necessary. You receive files, that's right, my understanding, but there is no direct linkages to any of the administrations, so that they can also profit from the work of having a central register. Thank you.
Yeah, so the first part of the question, there's not really any other kind of body that is maintaining this data completely. The property assessments, for example, are done by provincial agencies, but we have to go to each province separately. Municipalities do issue building permits, but there's no kind of inventory that they keep on an ongoing basis with all of the characteristics. But in terms of mutual benefits, there are definitely agreements being made with data providers in terms of they provide this data and then we provide back something to them. In terms of some of like the raw data files we're receiving from credit unions and credit card issuers, there are agreements in place where we'll order some of that data and then provide it back to them. In the same way, like with these property assessments, we'll order some of this data and then ultimately they'll have access to some of that data once it's been ordered by us a little bit. But we're finding, a lot of this data is coming to us. It's unstructured a lot of times, and we're having to do a lot of work cleaning it up. But yeah, there can be some benefit in terms of sharing that back then with the authorities. But there's not really an appetite in any one of them to maintain this the way that we're going to be maintaining it. So,
Thank you, Gigi.
Good morning. It's a very nice presentation and full of information, but I was confused a little bit because you are depending on your updates on registers that I think they don't have any identification numbers. You don't have any identification number for individuals or establishments, right?
well, we create those identification numbers. So, for example, if we receive a file from Tammy Hoogstein, a birth certificate, a driver's license, a passport, all those files we'd receive, we'd essentially strip off her name and she'd receive what's called an ISN, an individual statistical number. That number is maintained through time, through her life, until we receive a record that Tammy.
Yeah, but in this way, yeah, it is makes sense. But otherwise, I was confused. How when people move from addresses, how you link them together, or establishments, or even establishments, you are giving them statistical number.
So yeah, in our business register right now, enterprises, establishments, any operating unit receives a statistical number, an S number we call it. Currently on the BR, these can die and be reborn. If I own a business and then I sell it to someone else, that establishment number can change. But the longitudinal business register is supposed to essentially mitigate that effect. So we can follow this establishment from one business to another and know whether, for example, it's a new establishment, whether it's a continuing establishment that was just sold. And that's how we kind of can track more fully these entrepreneurship statistics and demographics.
Good. Thank you very much. I'm afraid there were a lot of questions on there, which is brilliant, and I think we're going to have to draw this one to a close now, even though I can't ask my question about the identification of businesses, which I think is really weird, but I'll talk to you about that separately. So thank you very much. Brilliant.
Thank you.
So thank you. So now we move on to Caterina from Italy, who's going to give us an example of the sort of policy type questions and the sort of information you can derive from linking registers together. Especially if you can work the technology.
The presentation.
Where's Claude?
This one?
Yeah. There.
No.
No? I think it's, you've got to click on there.
This one?
Try that one.
No.
No? Claude, you're going to have to keep coming up here.
Non ci aiutate proprio qua, Thank you. Oh, anche questi, no? Sì. Ok. Thank you, Andrew. I will present some results of an analysis that we carried out to delineate some profiles of entrepreneurs, especially for businesses involved in the international trade. This is just an example of a particular subpopulation that is of a certain interest. The examples, of course, are few. They present just a way to show the potentiality of analysis derived from a big integrated database where we use multiple sources of information, sources coming from the side of enterprises and linked with sources on people and individuals. The first reasons to build up this new database was on the basis of requirements asked from a project, and it's a Eurostar project in which Italy has been participating, the BD Tech project, that have the aim to improve the quality of tech statistics that are the trades by enterprise characteristics statistics with the addition of new information on business demography. This project gave a lot of results in terms of new classifications of new breakdowns, for example, looking at the age of the enterprise and combining this age with the type of trading of the unit. But in addition to this database, in ISTAT we have a lot of information also on the side of the relationships between the enterprises and the workers and individuals. And then we link the information on entrepreneurs' characteristics and also, for example, their ownership on the enterprise, like the belonging to the enterprise group or not. Starting from this huge integrated database, a possible taxonomy of exporter, native, foreign owned firm is one of the themes and the results that I'm going to present some examples. And another example was to profiles the entrepreneurs of agro enterprises, as the population of agro enterprises is very relevant in some study on the economic growth. Why it was possible? Because in our country we receive and we use a lot of administrative data and also statistical surveys. And especially in the last 2 years, we set up a system of statistical registers called SIR. That is a system, it's like an environment that support the statistical processes, all the statistical processes. In this system, every functional activity in the acquisition and identification of units is done just from a central structure. And then all these information are distributed for the all statistical processes. One of these is also the building up, the updating of business register. The potentiality of SIR stands in the fact that it is micro-founded. That means that all the information are archives at micro level, and that they have a unique system of conceptual and statistical integration. We have the same definition, we use the same metadata, the classification variables are shared, and also there is also a physical integration, and the physical integration means that every information from the administrative files are identified in a consistent manner by this function that is made by SIM, Integrated System of Microdata, that attribute an identification code, a unique identification code, both to the economic units, that means the legal units, for example, and to individuals. So we have a big database continuously updating in a unitary way by these functions. And of course, this system cover all the issues, the various issues that is the population and households. So we have the register of population and households, the register on production units, that is the business register, and the register on territory. Okay. So the business register is one of the base statistical register in the system, and it's very, it has a central role in the function of linking and connecting with the other statistical registers. The other registers that in this picture I call satellite registers means that in every statistical process build up using specific administrative files, build up a specific register that is a sort of extended register for some target populations in order to support and complement their productions with other information. For example, the first database that is directly connected with the statistical business register is the one having all the information on business demography and entrepreneurship indicators. This database, that is a sort of derivation of the analysis of a statistical business register, is directly linked to the business register because the unit is exactly the same. We produce on an annual basis a lot of information on births, deaths, survival rates. We add some record linkage procedures in order to identify continuity, and all the information are organized in this set of data and directly linked. There is no problem, for example, with respect to the statistical unit that is on the basis of the analysis of the business demography, as it is derived directly from the business register. Another database that we linked to the business register is the database on international trade. The international trade statistics, they are short-term statistics. They have these statistical domains produce this and update this database that in order to monitor the trading activities of Italian enterprises. In this case, the information is a little bit different, as they register information, the flows of EU intra and extra EU flows and export values, partner countries in the destination of trading and so on. And what is relevant to say that this domain of short-term statistics, they use the statistical business register in order to produce these tech statistics. It's done on a regularly basis. However, there are some problems of connecting these two kinds of units, as the reporting units of the international trade is not exactly the enterprise, but is an administrative unit. It's the V8 code that the trader use in making these transactions. So in this sense, some quality and some further analysis in alignment these units is necessary. And finally, the third database that support with all the information on economic accounts is the so-called Frame SPS. This database was developed in the field from the side of the SBS statistical SBS statistics. It's micro-founded. That means that for each enterprises belong to the SBS target population, we have all the core statistical variables that are on the key principal accounts coming from the integration of fiscal information, income statements, annual report. So from this kind of information, let's say that any analysis on the performance and of the enterprises can be carried out, and that the national accounts, for example, they use this database and they just sum up all the micro level information to get to and to reach and produce the GDP. So this big register, this big database was created, was integrated, first of all, because we participated in this project, where the principal goal was to integrate the information on export and import with the business demographic characteristics and enrich this information with indicators on economic performance. The project covered 4 topics. The first was link this business demography statistics with tech in order, for example, to get information about the kind of population, young instead of existing from many times, for example, and to link the behavior in export and import in comparison to this kind of populations. In the second topics, there was an additional need to have information about the different breakdowns for the NACE as long as for the partner countries and the type of trader. That means that, for example, a breakdown is if the trader is just an exporter or it's a two-way exporter or occasional or not, for example. There are many dimensions in this kind of project. And the third topics add to the previous the indicators on economic performance. And then there was a fourth topic that was mainly aiming at improve the methodology, because one of the topics that is under analysis in this period is how to fulfill with the problem of link census population with, for example, information based on samples, and how to gross up this information in order that all the units in the population can be covered for some variables, for example. So let's say that this is the first example of the results that I present. And in this, sorry for the scale, there was an error in the picture. It's without the percentage, without the 2-0, because it was added by the Excel files. Sorry, but I cannot change the graph. However, in this picture, this is a result. We have the combined population of exporting and non-exporting enterprises, and if this exporting or non-exporting were newly born enterprises or enterprises living for a long time. In this case, it's very clear that in the red spot, the productivity is higher for the exporters, of course, both if they are new or they are very old. This is very evident in the services. Instead, for example, in manufacturing, the exporting or non-exporting is not so relevant. Productivity is much more greater for the existing enterprises, of course. However, that was the big data set that we built up for the project, but the new things were to link still more information in order to get more possibility to delineate the entrepreneur profiles. That means the persons that own, manage the enterprise. In ISTAT, since 2010, we developed a so-called LEAD database. LEAD stands for the Linked Employer Employees Database. It's obtained and updated yearly from the integration of many administrative files that give us the information on the relationships between the enterprise and the worker. So each worker is linked by codes to the enterprise for which it works. We classified this kind of workers of employment. Lead employment is the overall system of employment as self-employment employees, outworkers, and so on. And deriving exactly from this lead employment database, another subset of database called lead entrepreneurs that was built up 2 years ago, because we adopted a specific definition of who is the entrepreneur. In fact, in the Wiesbaden group of 2 years ago, we presented the methodology how to identify the entrepreneurs that is a little bit different with the self-employment itself. In this way, we have a lot of information, and what is relevant is to focus on something. In this case, we focus on 2 themes that are, the first one is to understand the behavior of native or foreign-owned businesses engaged in trading activities. And we will see some outputs. And another one is if it's possible to profile entrepreneurs involved in high-growth firms, for example, using statistical techniques of clustering. This is one of the examples of relating to the first issue. In this case, our question was maybe foreign people managing exporting firms have an advantage in foreign markets, especially when they come from the same country of origin. They have the same country of the partner country where they trade. In this case, the subpopulation is exactly the exporter enterprises, that is a subset, of course, of the total population. And what was relevant in this case is that the incidence of traders is mainly affected by the size of the enterprise, and that there is a sort of correlation between these incidents and the presence of foreign people inside the enterprise. Of course, this exporting population is small in comparison to the others, and the Italians are the people that are most present in the enterprises that make trading. However, we give a first classification, potential classification of companies on the basis of the country of origin of the entrepreneur. So we classified the companies in the companies managed by only Italians, by foreign only, and both mixed. On the basis on this subpopulation, let's say that of course there is this big evidence of Italians. However, among exporters, the foreign components is bigger. This is another example of correlations. In addition to the first one, we look at the enterprise composition in terms of country of origin, not only of the entrepreneur, but also of the workers' composition, in order to understand if they tend to hire foreign people of the same country or not. Or in general, it's not so evident, this correlation. In these 2 examples, I just put the examples of enterprises managed by entrepreneurs only Italians and only foreign. What is evident for me is that for the first group, what is relevant is if they they make trade, they trade.